The morning the Duke of Ashford ordered his men to turn Miss Alara Voss away from the gates of Whitmore Park, the rain was coming down in cold, relentless sheets, the kind that soaked through wool and settled into bone. She had traveled 4 hours by carriage to be there. She had not brought an umbrella. She had not brought a companion or a maid or even a letter of introduction, because she had not thought she would need one. She had thought, foolishly perhaps, that a woman arriving on legitimate business would be received as such. She was not. The 2 men at the gate were large and unsmiling, the kind of servants hired not for their manners but for their size. They looked at her the way men in their position often looked at women in hers, with the particular brand of contempt that belongs to those who borrow their power from someone else's name. "No visitors," the taller one said without looking at her directly. "His Grace's orders." Ilara stood very still. The rain ran down the brim of her hat and dripped onto the collar of her coat. Behind her, on the road, her driver sat waiting, pretending not to have heard. She looked at the gate. It was iron, old and elaborate, with the Ashford crest worked into the center, a falcon with its wings spread, proud and sharp-eyed. She had seen a sketch of it once, in her grandmother's papers, tucked between a property deed and a letter written in faded ink. Her grandmother had described those gates in that letter, had described commissioning them, in fact. Had written, in her careful, unhurried hand, about watching the ironworker set them into the stone pillars on a cold October morning in 1809. "They are finer than I imagined," her grandmother had written. "I hope whoever stands before them one day understands what they are really looking at." Ilara understood. She did not say so. She did not say anything at all. She simply looked at the 2 men for a long moment, long enough that the taller one shifted his weight uncomfortably, and then she turned, walked back to the carriage and climbed inside. Her driver glanced at her in the mirror. "Back to the inn, miss." "Yes," she said. She was already drawing a small piece of paper from her bag, "and stop at the post office on the way." She wrote the note in 4 sentences. She did not waste words. She had learned, a long time ago, that the people who spoke the most in a room were rarely the ones holding the most cards. She folded the note, sealed it, and addressed it to Mr. Harold Finch, solicitor, Lincoln's Inn, London. Then she looked out the window at the gates of Whitmore Park as the carriage pulled away, at the iron falcon with its proud spread wings, and she allowed herself one small, private thought. We are just getting started. The village of Ashworth Cross had not had much to talk about since the old Duke died. That had been 14 months ago, a quiet death, as deaths went, the kind that came at the end of a long illness and surprised no one, least of all the man himself. What had surprised people, and given them considerably more to discuss over garden fences and in the back pews of Sunday services, was the state of things afterward. The estate was in trouble. Everyone knew it, though no one said it plainly in mixed company. They said things like, "The new Duke has his work cut out for him," and "Whitmore Park needs attention," and "it's a great responsibility for a young man." What they meant was that the Ashford family had been spending money it didn't have for the better part of 2 decades, and the new Duke had inherited not just a title and a house, but a very long list of debts with very impatient men attached to them. The new Duke, Edmund Ashford, 31 years old, recently returned from 3 years in Europe that had done nothing to improve either his finances or his temperament, had arrived at Whitmore Park in September and immediately set about making it clear that he intended to manage the situation his own way. His way, as far as the household staff could tell, involved a great deal of closed-door meetings, a great deal of correspondence, and a near-total ban on unannounced visitors. "No one gets through those gates without my prior approval," he had told Mr. Gaines, his head steward on his first morning in residence. "I don't care who they are or what they claim their business is. No exceptions." Mr. Gaines, who had worked for the Ashford family for 23 years and had seen 3 dukes come and go, had simply nodded and relayed the order to the gate staff. He had not asked what to do if the visitor in question turned out to have a legitimate claim on the property itself. It had not seemed like the kind of thing he needed to ask about. That particular oversight would, in the weeks to come, cost everyone involved a considerable amount of sleep. The woman who had arrived at the gates that morning was not what anyone in Ashworth Cross would have described as remarkable. She was perhaps 28, slender, with dark eyes, and the kind of composed, unremarkable face that people tended to forget until they found themselves thinking about it unexpectedly at odd hours. She dressed well but not extravagantly. She did not wear her money loudly, which was, as it happened, one of the reasons people consistently underestimated how much of it she had. Her name was Ilara Voss. She had grown up 60 miles north of Ashworth Cross, in a house that was considerably smaller than it had once been, raised by a grandmother who had taught her 3 things above all others: patience, precision, and the importance of documentation. Anyone can make a claim, her grandmother, Helena Voss, had told her once, when Ilara was 12 years old and sitting at the old woman's feet while she sorted through a wooden box of papers. The difference between a claim and a fact is proof. Never confuse the two. Ilara had not confused them, not once in all the years since. Helena Voss had died when Ilara was 19, leaving her a modest amount of money, the smaller house, a wooden box full of papers, and a secret that Helena had carried for 40 years, which she had decided in the end was better passed to someone younger, someone with more time to use it properly. "There will come a moment," Helena had written in the letter left with the box, "when it will matter. You will know when. Don't move before then. Patience is not weakness. It is the longest game there is and the one most worth winning." Ilara had waited 9 years. She had not been idle during those 9 years. She had managed the household finances with a precision that would have startled most men who assumed she couldn't. She had read every document in that wooden box so many times she could have recited them from memory. She had built a quiet, careful correspondence with Mr. Harold Finch, her grandmother's solicitor, who was 70 years old and deeply principled, and had handled the Voss family's legal affairs for longer than Ilara had been alive. And she had watched from a distance as Whitmore Park changed hands. When the old Duke died, she had known it was time. She had not expected, precisely, to be turned away at the gate. She had considered the possibility, had understood in the abstract, that the new Duke was unlikely to be expecting her, but she had assumed that the combination of her name and a stated intention to discuss a legal matter would at minimum result in being shown to a sitting room to wait. She had been wrong about that. It was, she acknowledged privately, a useful reminder that people rarely behaved as logically as one hoped. It did not change anything. Back at the inn, she changed out of her wet coat, ordered tea, and sat by the window with her grandmother's papers spread across the small writing desk. She did not read them. She did not need to. She simply looked at them, at her grandmother's careful handwriting on the property deed, at the signatures and the seals, at the date written in the corner. October 14th, 1809. Then she looked out the window at the gray sky over Ashworth Cross, at the distant tree line that marked the edge of the Whitmore Park estate, and she thought about iron gates and proud falcons and men who gave orders without understanding what they were ordering. The note she had sent to Mr. Finch was simple. "It is time. Please proceed as we discussed. I will remain in Ashworth Cross until further notice." She poured her tea. She added no sugar. She sat back in the chair and picked up her book, and she read 3 chapters with perfect calm, and she waited. She had always been very good at waiting. Edmund Ashford did not think about the woman at the gate. This was not unusual. Edmund did not, as a general rule, spend much time thinking about people who inconvenienced him. It was one of the habits he had developed over a lifetime of being the kind of man whose inconveniences were quietly handled by other people before they had the chance to become actual problems. Someone had been turned away at the gate. Gaines had mentioned it briefly over the evening report. In the same tone, he used to mention that the east drawing room chimney was smoking again, or that one of the kitchen cats had gotten into the larder. A minor disturbance. A woman claiming business of some kind, now gone. Edmund had nodded and moved on. He had larger things to think about. He was sitting now at the desk in his father's study. His study, he reminded himself, though the room still smelled of the old man's tobacco and still had his father's taste in furniture, which ran toward the heavy and the dark, with 3 separate ledgers open in front of him, and the particular expression of a man trying to make mathematics behave differently than it was inclined to. The numbers were not behaving. He knew the broad shape of the problem, had known it, in fact, since before his father died, had been receiving careful, increasingly worried letters from the family solicitor for the better part of 2 years, letters he had read and considered, and then set aside while he was in Florence and Rome and Vienna, where setting things aside was considerably easier than it was here, sitting in this chair, with the rain on the windows and the numbers in the ledgers refusing to cooperate. The Ashford estate was not ruined. He wanted to be precise about that, at least in the privacy of his own mind. Ruined was too dramatic, and Edmund had a deep dislike of drama, which was ironic given the circumstances he currently found himself in. Strained was the more accurate word. Leveraged, encumbered with obligations that had been accumulating quietly for 20 years, each one individually manageable, collectively rather less so. The house needed work. The tenant farms needed investment. There were 3 outstanding loans from London banks, 2 of which were attached to interest rates that his father had apparently agreed to without reading the relevant clauses particularly carefully, and one of which had a repayment deadline that was, Edmund had recently discovered, considerably closer than he had been led to believe. The solution, as several people had not been shy about pointing out to him, was straightforward. He needed to marry money. Edmund leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. This was not, in principle, something he objected to. Arranged marriages, or at minimum strategic ones, were hardly unusual in his world. Most of the men he knew had married with at least one eye on the balance sheet, and most of those marriages had turned out perfectly acceptable, comfortable even. He was not a romantic. He did not have particular illusions about what marriage was at its foundation in his social position. What he objected to was the specific version of this solution that his mother had been pressing on him since approximately 30 minutes after his father's funeral. Lady Ashford, his mother, a small, determined woman who had managed the Ashford social calendar with the precision of a military campaign for 35 years, had a candidate. She always had a candidate. In this case, the candidate was a Miss Georgiana Hartwell, daughter of Sir Reginald Hartwell, who had made an enormous amount of money in shipping, and was now in the business of purchasing respectability for his family through the mechanism of marrying his daughter to a title. Miss Hartwell was, by all accounts, perfectly pleasant. She was also 20 years old, which Edmund found faintly depressing, though he acknowledged this was not a reasonable objection given the customs of the time. He had agreed to meet her. There was a dinner planned for the following month, at his mother's house in Bath, where Miss Hartwell and her father would be present along with a carefully curated collection of other guests, chosen to make the whole thing feel less like an inspection and more like a social occasion, despite being, quite explicitly, an inspection. Edmund had not yet decided how he felt about it. He closed the top ledger and pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. "Mr. Gaines," he said, without raising his voice. Gaines had a talent for being present without appearing to hover, which Edmund appreciated. The steward materialized at the study door. "Your Grace." The woman at the gate this morning. You said she mentioned a legal matter. Gaines paused, with the faint expression of a man reaching back through a day's worth of events. She did, Your Grace. She gave her name as Miss Voss. She said she had business relating to the property. Voss, Edmund repeated. The name meant nothing to him. Did she leave a card? She did not. She left rather quickly, all told. It was raining considerably. Edmund considered this for a moment, then dismissed it. People arrived at estates with claims relating to property on a regular basis, particularly estates in the kind of financial circumstances Whitmore Park currently occupied. Creditors sent representatives. Former tenants surfaced with complaints. Distant relations of previous owners occasionally appeared with theories about inheritance that invariably turned out to be baseless. It was tiresome but not alarming. If she returns, have her wait in the morning room and inform me, he said. I'll hear what she has to say. He did not actually expect her to return. People who were turned away at gates usually went away and stayed away, particularly if they lacked the social position to insist otherwise. Very good, Your Grace, Gaines said and disappeared. Edmund turned back to his ledgers. He was still at his desk 3 hours later when the Evening Post arrived, a small stack of correspondence sorted by Gaines in order of apparent urgency, with the household bills at the bottom and the London correspondence at the top. Edmund worked through it methodically, the way he did everything, quickly, without sentiment, setting each letter aside once he had extracted whatever information it contained. He was nearly at the bottom of the stack when he reached the letter from Mr. Aldous Pemberton, his family solicitor in London. He almost set it aside unread. Pemberton wrote frequently and at considerable length, and his letters, while thorough, rarely contained information that qualified as genuinely new. Edmund had come to think of them as elaborate restatements of things he already knew, dressed in legal language. He opened this one anyway, because Pemberton had marked it urgent in the upper left corner, which he had never done before. He read it once quickly, the way he read everything. Then he read it again, more slowly this time. Then he set it down on the desk and sat very still for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular, while something cold and unfamiliar settled in the region of his chest. The letter was not long, for Pemberton. It came to the point with an efficiency that was entirely unlike the solicitor's usual style, which suggested to Edmund that Pemberton had understood the information was serious enough that brevity was warranted. The relevant section was a single paragraph. It has come to my attention, through correspondence received today from a Mr. Harold Finch of Lincoln's Inn, acting on behalf of his client Miss Alara Voss, that a deed of conditional ownership exists pertaining to the Whitmore Park estate and its attendant grounds, executed in October of 1809 between the late Mr. Arthur Voss and the late Duke of Ashford, your grandfather. The terms of this deed, if legitimate, and Finch is a man of considerable reputation, and I have no immediate reason to doubt him, would place the primary ownership of Whitmore Park in the hands of the Voss family, with the Ashford title serving in an occupying capacity, contingent on conditions that appear not to have been met. I strongly advise Your Grace to seek legal counsel at the earliest possible opportunity. I will travel to Ashworth Cross at your instruction. Edmund read the paragraph a third time. Then he looked up, at the dark paneled walls of his father's study, at the heavy curtains and the old furniture and the portrait above the fireplace of his grandfather. The late Duke, young and confident, painted before any of this had apparently happened. He thought about the woman in the rain. He thought about the name she had given. Voss. He reached for the bell on his desk and rang it, harder than he intended. Gaines appeared within seconds. He took one look at Edmund's expression and became very carefully neutral, the way experienced servants did when they understood that something had gone wrong and were waiting to find out how wrong. Get Pemberton on the first available coach from London, Edmund said. His voice was even. He had always been able to keep his voice even, whatever else was happening. And find out where Miss Voss is staying. Gaines did not ask why. Yes, Your Grace. One more thing. Edmund looked down at the letter again, at the date in the corner, at the year 1809 written in Pemberton's careful hand. The men at the gate this morning, were they rude to her? A pause. I couldn't say with certainty, Your Grace. Which meant yes. Edmund set the letter down. I see, he said, and said nothing else. Helena Voss had not been a dramatic woman. This was, Alara had always thought, one of the most remarkable things about her, that she had carried something this significant for this long, with such complete and undisturbed composure. No bitterness, no urgency, no late-night speeches about justice or inheritance or what the Ashford family had taken from them. Just the wooden box and the papers and the patient, unhurried certainty that things would resolve themselves in the correct order if one simply refused to rush them. Alara was sitting with that box open on the desk in front of her now, in the small, slightly damp room at the Ashworth Cross Inn, with a candle lit against the early dark of the autumn evening. She was not reading the documents. She knew them too well for that. She was simply looking at them, the way she sometimes did when she needed to remember that what she was doing was real, that it was grounded in something solid and documented and true, and not just a story she had been telling herself for 9 years. The deed was at the top. It was written on heavy paper, the kind that lasted, in the careful formal language of 1809 solicitors, who understood that the words they chose might need to hold up for a very long time. The signatures at the bottom were both clear, Arthur Voss, in her great-grandfather's confident hand, and William Ashford, the second Duke, in a script that was slightly less steady, which Alara had always privately attributed to the fact that he had been, by all accounts, 3 glasses of brandy into the evening when he signed it. The circumstances, as Helena had explained them and as the accompanying letters confirmed, were these. In the autumn of 1809, the second Duke of Ashford had found himself in a position not entirely unlike the one his grandson currently occupied, which was to say, in possession of a title and an estate and very little else. The Ashford family had always had expensive tastes and inconsistent income, and the second Duke had inherited both tendencies in full measure. By October of that year, the debts against Whitmore Park were significant enough that the estate itself was at risk. Arthur Voss had been, at that time, one of the wealthiest men in the northern counties. He had made his money in wool and property, and a series of exceptionally well-timed investments, and he had made it quietly, without fanfare, in the way that men of his generation and temperament tended to steadily, over decades, with more attention to substance than appearance. He had also, as it happened, been Helena's father, Ilara's great-grandfather. The 2 men had known each other slightly, not well, but enough. They had met at a county dinner some years earlier, had spoken several times afterward in the way that men of different stations sometimes did when one of them was rich enough to make the difference in station feel irrelevant. When the Duke's situation became genuinely critical, it was Arthur Voss he had approached. Not a bank, not a London creditor. Voss. Arthur had listened, had reviewed the ledgers. He had always insisted on seeing the ledgers, Helena said, regardless of what he was being asked to invest in, had understood the situation clearly, and then he had made a proposal that the Duke, in his desperation, had accepted. The money Arthur Voss provided was not a loan. It was a purchase, not of the title that couldn't be sold, but of the estate itself, the grounds and the house and everything attached to them, transferred to the Voss family by deed with a single condition. The Ashford family could continue to live there, to use the Whitmore Park name, to occupy the house as their seat, so long as they maintained the property in good order and met certain financial obligations outlined in a secondary document. If those conditions were met, the Voss family would make no claim. The arrangement would remain, as Arthur had put it, a private matter between gentlemen. If the conditions were not met, the deed stood as written. The conditions had not been met. They had in fact been ignored almost entirely. Almost certainly because the second Duke had died within 5 years of signing the agreement, and the document had been filed away somewhere in the Ashford family's legal records and either forgotten or deliberately buried, and the Voss family had, at Arthur's own instruction, said nothing. He was not a vengeful man, Helena had told Alara once, speaking of her father with the particular precision she used for things that mattered. He did not want to destroy them. He wanted the truth to exist, documented, witnessed, undeniable, so that when the time came, there would be no argument about it. What time? Alara had asked. She had been perhaps 15. Helena had considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. The time when the right person needed it, she had said finally. Your great-grandfather believed that things had a way of arriving at their proper moment if you let them. Alara had thought about that answer for 13 years. She was still thinking about it. She reached into the box and drew out the other document, not the deed, but the letter. Helena's letter, the one left with the box, the one Alara had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. She did not read it now either. She just held it, feeling the weight of it, the texture of the paper. Then she set it carefully back in the box, closed the lid, and turned to the window. Outside, the rain had stopped. The village was quiet, the street below lit by a single lamp that swayed slightly in the wind. In the distance, through the trees, she could just make out the shape of Whitmore Park's roofline against the dark sky, the chimneys, the upper windows, the silhouette of the old house standing as it had stood for 150 years. Her grandmother had stood in this village, Alara thought, had looked at that roofline, had known what she knew and said nothing and waited. Alara understood patience. She had been taught it by the best possible teacher. But she was also, she acknowledged privately, very tired of waiting. There was a knock at the door. She turned, yes. It was the innkeeper's daughter, a girl of about 16 with an apologetic expression and a folded note in her hand. Begging your pardon, miss. A man brought this just now, said it was urgent. Alara took the note, thanked the girl, waited until the door closed and opened it. It was from Mr. Finch, 3 sentences. Your letter received and acted upon. Pemberton has been notified he will travel from London within the week. And Miss Voss, a message came to my office this afternoon from Whitmore Park. The Duke wishes to meet. Alara read it twice. Then she set it on the desk beside the wooden box, and for the first time since she had arrived in Ashworth Cross, she allowed herself a small, real smile. Not triumphant, not unkind. Just the smile of a woman who had waited 9 years for a particular door to open and had just heard, quite distinctly, the sound of the latch. She sat down at the writing desk, drew out a fresh piece of paper, and wrote her reply to Mr. Finch in the same unhurried hand her grandmother had taught her. Please inform the Duke that I am available Thursday morning. He may suggest a location, but I would find Whitmore Park itself most convenient. She paused, then she added one more line. The front entrance this time. She folded the note, sealed it, and set it by the door to be sent in the morning. Then she went to bed, and she slept for the first time in several weeks very soundly. Thursday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of autumn day that looked beautiful from a window and was considerably less pleasant once you were actually standing in it. Alara dressed carefully. Not extravagantly, she had considered that and rejected it. Extravagance would look like effort, and effort would look like nerves, and she was not nervous. Or rather, she was slightly, in the way that anyone was before something they had been anticipating for a very long time, but she had no intention of letting that show in the cut of her coat or the arrangement of her hair. She chose a deep green dress, well made and well fitted, and her grandmother's brooch, a small thing, silver, shaped like a sprig of something botanical pinned at her collar. Practical boots, her good gloves. She looked, she decided, like a woman who had come to discuss business. Which was precisely what she was. The carriage arrived at Whitmore Park at 10 o'clock exactly. The gates were open. This was, she noted, a considerable improvement over her last visit. The drive up to the house was longer than she had expected, a quarter-mile at least, through parkland that was beautiful in the way that old, slightly neglected things often were, the trees enormous and overgrown, the lawns in need of attention but still carrying the bones of something that had once been genuinely grand. The house itself, when it came into view, stopped her breath slightly, which she had not anticipated. She had seen drawings of it, descriptions. She had formed a picture in her mind over 9 years of thinking about this place, and the picture had been detailed enough that she had assumed the reality would simply confirm it. The reality was larger, older, more beautiful and more melancholy at the same time, in the particular way of houses that have been many things to many people over a very long time. The stone was pale gray, darkened by weather at the corners, with tall windows that caught the morning light and a facade that was formal without being cold, or would have been if someone had been taking proper care of it. She could see, even from the carriage, that they hadn't been. The steps needed repointing. 2 of the upper windows had frames that wanted painting. The flower beds along the front were overgrown and going to seed. Small things, individually. Together they told a story she already knew the outline of. She stepped out of the carriage, straightened her gloves and walked up the front steps. The door was opened before she reached it, not by a footman, which she had expected, but by Mr. Gaines himself, which she had not. The steward was a slight, silver-haired man with the expression of someone who had seen a great deal in his professional life, and had learned to respond to most of it with the same careful neutrality. He looked at her with something she could not quite read, not unfriendly, not the contempt of the gate men, but something more considered than either. "Miss Voss," he said, "His Grace is expecting you if you'll follow me." She followed him through the entrance hall, which was magnificent even now, with its black and white marble floor, and the staircase rising in a wide sweep to the upper floors, and down a corridor lined with portraits she did not look at, though she was aware of them, and through a set of double doors into what turned out to be not the formal drawing room she had expected but the library. It was the right choice of room for this conversation, she thought, neutral, functional, less theatrical than a drawing room, less intimidating than a study. Someone had thought about it. She was not sure, yet, whether that someone was the Duke or Mr. Gaines. Edmund Ashford was standing at the far end of the room, beside one of the tall windows, with his back partially to her when she entered. He turned when he heard the door. She had not formed a picture of him the way she had of the house. She had known his name, his age, the broad outlines of his biography, the years in Europe, the return, the title inherited with all its complications. She had not spent time imagining his face, because his face was not relevant to what she was here to do. She found, somewhat inconveniently, that it was not an easy face to ignore. He was tall, taller than she had pictured, abstractly, with dark hair and the particular kind of features that looked as though they had been arranged with some care by whoever was responsible for such things. He was not smiling. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized immediately, because she had been on the receiving end of versions of it her entire adult life. The expression of a man recalibrating rapidly, adjusting some prior assumption without wanting to appear to be doing so. She had been shorter in his imagination, she suspected, less composed, less something. She gave him a moment to finish recalibrating, then said pleasantly, "Your Grace." "Miss Voss." His voice was even, controlled. She noted that. "Please sit down." She sat. He remained standing for a moment. She thought it was probably habit, the instinct to maintain height in a room, And then, apparently catching himself, sat down as well, in the chair across from her with the low table between them. There was tea on the table, also untouched. "I'll come to the point," he said. "I've had my solicitor review the document Mr. Finch sent. Pemberton arrived yesterday." "I know," she said. "Mr. Finch informed me." Something moved across his face at that, not quite annoyance. Adjustment again. He was not accustomed, she thought, to conversations in which the other person already knew things. "Then you know that Pemberton has not yet reached a conclusion about the deed's validity." "I know that he has reached no public conclusion," Alara said carefully, "which is not quite the same thing." A pause, longer than the ones before it. "No," Edmund said after a moment, "I suppose it isn't." He looked at her directly then, for the first time since she had sat down, really looked, in the way that people sometimes didn't, particularly men of his position looking at women of her nominal station. She met it without difficulty. She had been preparing for this conversation in one form or another for 9 years. "What is it you want, Miss Voss?" he asked, not rudely. Genuinely, she thought, with the directness of a man who had decided that the most efficient path through this particular situation was a straight one. She respected that, even now, even under the circumstances. "What I want," she said, "is quite simple. I want what my great-grandfather's document entitles my family to, not more than that." "Which is the estate?" "Which is acknowledgement of the deed," she corrected. "What follows from that acknowledgement is a matter for solicitors and negotiation. I have not come here to remove you from your home, Your Grace. I am not interested in that." He studied her. She could see him trying to locate the angle, the hidden motive, the thing she wasn't saying. It was what she would have done in his position. "Then what," he said slowly, "are you interested in?" It was a better question than she had expected from him at this stage. She filed that away. "Fairness," she said. "My great-grandfather gave your grandfather a considerable amount of money under specific terms. Those terms were not honored. I would like them to be honored now, in whatever form makes sense given that 100 years have passed and the world has changed considerably since 1809. That is all." Edmund said nothing for a moment. He was looking at the untouched tea, she noticed, with the expression of a man whose mind was entirely elsewhere. Then he looked up. And something happened in the room that she had not prepared for. It was not dramatic. There was no particular moment she could have pointed to afterward and said there, that was it. It was simply that he looked at her, really looked, past the document and the deed and the legal inconvenience of her presence. And she had the sudden, uncomfortable sensation of being seen by someone who was rather more perceptive than she had been accounting for. "You've been waiting a long time to do this," he said. It was not a question. She held his gaze. "Yes." "Since your grandmother." She did not ask how he knew about Helena. Pemberton would have investigated. "Since before that, in a sense. Since my great-grandfather made the decision not to act immediately. It was always meant to be eventual." "Eventual," he repeated. Something in his voice shifted slightly. "That's a patient word." "My family has always been patient." He was quiet again. Outside, through the tall windows, the parkland stretched away in the pale morning light, the overgrown lawns, the enormous trees. His estate, her family's estate. Both things simultaneously in the way that only legal documents and history could manage. "I owe you an apology," he said abruptly. She blinked. She had not been expecting that. "I beg your pardon." "The men at the gate," he said, "the morning you arrived, I'm told they were not courteous." He said it flatly, without embellishment, in the tone of a man who found the admission uncomfortable but had decided to make it anyway. That should not have happened, regardless of the circumstances. Ilara looked at him for a long moment. She had prepared carefully for arrogance, for dismissal, for legal maneuvering and social condescension, and the particular brand of entitlement that men in his position wore like a second coat. She had prepared for all of those things. She had not prepared for this. "Thank you," she said, carefully, meaning it and not entirely sure what to do with the fact that she meant it. He nodded once. Then he stood. The meeting, apparently, had reached some natural conclusion that he had decided on, and she stood as well. "I'd like to propose a further meeting," he said, "with both our solicitors present, in the next week if that suits you." "It suits me," she said. He walked her to the door of the library himself, which Gaines would normally have done. She noticed that too. At the door he paused, and she had the impression that he was going to say something beyond the formal, beyond the legal, and then thought better of it. She did not press. She walked back down the corridor, past the portraits and the marble floor, out through the front door and down the front steps to her waiting carriage. She did not look back at the house. But in the carriage, on the road back to the village, she sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked out at the passing trees and tried to account for the fact that the meeting had gone entirely as planned, and she felt, inexplicably, as though something had happened that she had not planned for at all. She did not examine the feeling closely. Not yet. The meeting with the solicitors took place the following Tuesday, in the library at Whitmore Park, with Mr. Pemberton and Mr. Finch seated on opposite sides of the table like chess pieces that had not yet decided whether they were playing the same game. It lasted 3 hours. Alara sat through all of it with her hands folded and her expression composed, watching the two men talk around the central fact of the situation in the elaborate, circuitous way that solicitors did when the central fact was inconvenient for at least one of their clients. Pemberton was thorough and careful and clearly intelligent, and he had spent the better part of a week looking for a flaw in the 1809 deed, and he had not found one, which was evident from the particular quality of his thoroughness. The way a man is most meticulous when he is hoping that meticulousness will eventually turn up something he needs. It had not turned up anything. Mr. Finch, who was 70 years old and had been Helena Voss's solicitor since before Alara was born, sat across from Pemberton with the serene confidence of a man holding a very good hand at cards and in absolutely no hurry to lay it down. Edmund sat at the head of the table and said very little. He asked 2 precise questions, both of which suggested he had read the deed himself and understood it more thoroughly than most men in his position would have bothered to. Alara noted this without allowing herself to find it interesting. She was finding rather too many things about Edmund Ashford interesting, and she was doing her best to stop. By the time the meeting concluded, with no resolution, as these meetings rarely resolved anything on the first attempt, but with a clear picture of where things stood legally, the afternoon light had gone flat and gray, and Gaines had appeared with a quiet offer of refreshment that everyone accepted with the relief of people who had been sitting in a room of concentrated tension for too long. Finch and Pemberton retreated to a corner of the library to continue their conversation in lower voices. Alara stood at one of the tall windows with a cup of tea she wasn't particularly drinking, looking out at the parkland. The lawns were darker now in the fading light, the trees at the far edge of the grounds merging into shadow. She heard Edmund approach. She did not turn. "You knew Pemberton wouldn't find anything," he said. "Not an accusation, an observation." "I knew the document was sound," she said. "Your grandfather's solicitor in 1809 was extremely thorough. My great-grandfather made certain of it." "Voss didn't trust my grandfather." "He trusted him precisely as much as the situation warranted," Alara said. "Which is to say he trusted the document more than the man. That is generally wise." A pause. Edmund came to stand beside her at the window, not close enough to be improper, close enough that she was aware of him in the particular way she had been trying not to be aware of him since Tuesday morning. "What happens now?" he asked. "Practically speaking." "Practically speaking, your solicitor and mine will correspond for several weeks and reach the same conclusion they reached today, and then we will have another meeting and discuss options. It is a slow process." "I'm aware of how legal processes work, Miss Voss." "Then you'll know that you have time," she said, "to consider your position, to think about what a reasonable resolution might look like." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a crow landed on the near lawn and then immediately left again, apparently finding the grass unsatisfactory. "And if I were to consider an unreasonable resolution," Edmund said. Something in his tone made her turn and look at him directly. He was not looking at her. He was looking out the window, at the crow's abandoned landing spot. But there was something deliberate in the way he had said it, the careful casualness of a man approaching a subject he had been circling for some time. "That would depend," she said slowly, "on what you meant by unreasonable." He turned then. He had, she had noticed, the habit of looking at people with more directness than they were usually expecting, not rudely, but with a completeness that made it difficult to look away. "I mean," he said, "a resolution that addresses the legal situation while also addressing the other situation." "What other situation?" "The situation," he said, with the precision of a man choosing words very carefully, "in which I need to marry money, and you are in possession of a legal claim that makes the financial future of this estate significantly uncertain, and there is a solution to both problems that a practical person might consider worth examining." Ilara looked at him for a long moment. Then she understood. "You are suggesting," she said, making sure she had it right, "that I marry you." "I am suggesting," Edmund said, "that it would solve several problems simultaneously." The room was very quiet. At the far end of the library, Finch and Pemberton continued their murmured conversation, oblivious. Ilara turned back to the window. She needed a moment, not because she was flustered, or not only because of that, but because she wanted to be certain before she responded, that she was responding to what he had actually said, and not to the several complicated things she was feeling about it. He had not said, "I find you remarkable." He had not said, "I have thought of little else since you walked into this library." He had not said any of the things that the situation in a different kind of story might have called for. He had said, "It would solve several problems simultaneously." He had offered her a transaction, cleanly and without ornament, in the same tone he might have used to propose a modification to a lease agreement. It was, she thought, either the least romantic proposal in the history of the English aristocracy, or it was the most honest one. Neither of those things made it acceptable. "No," she said. The word landed in the quiet between them, with considerable weight. Edmund said nothing immediately. She could feel him recalibrating again, that same adjustment she had noticed at their first meeting, the rapid internal revision of an assumption. And she had the sense that "no" was not a word he encountered very often in this particular context. "No," he repeated, not quite a question. "No," she confirmed. "I appreciate the directness of the proposal, Your Grace. I am going to be equally direct in return. I did not spend 9 years documenting a legal claim in order to exchange it for a marriage. If I wanted to be managed, I had considerably more convenient opportunities before this one. I wasn't suggesting—" "You were suggesting," she said, not unkindly, a transaction. "Your title in this house in exchange for my claim and presumably my money, with the form of a marriage wrapped around it to make it socially legible. I understand the logic. It is, as you say, practical, but I am not interested in practical in that particular direction." Edmund looked at her. There was something in his expression she couldn't immediately read, something that wasn't quite what she had expected, which was irritation or wounded pride. "What direction are you interested in?" he asked. The question was quiet. Genuinely quiet, not strategic, she thought, not another approach to the same destination. Just a question. She opened her mouth to answer, and then didn't, because at that precise moment the door to the library opened and Gaines appeared with a fresh tray. And the moment, whatever it had been, dissolved into the ordinary business of the room. She was back at the inn by 5 o'clock. She sat at the writing desk without lighting the candle, in the gray early evening light, and she thought about the afternoon with the disciplined attention she tried to bring to all things that mattered. She thought about the proposal. She thought about the way she had said no, and the way he had received it, and the question he had asked afterward. She thought about the window and the crow, and the particular quality of the silence between them that she could not quite classify. She thought, against her better judgment, about his face when she had turned to look at him. She was still thinking when there was a knock at the door. The innkeeper's daughter again, with the same apologetic expression. "A gentleman downstairs, miss. Says he's been hoping to call on you, and he heard you were in Ashworth Cross." Ilara frowned slightly. "What gentleman?" "A Mr. Cavendish, miss. Mr. Robert Cavendish. He says he's an old acquaintance." Ilara was still for a moment. Then she rose from the desk and smoothed her dress and said, "Tell him I'll be down in 5 minutes," in a voice that gave nothing away. Robert Cavendish. She had not expected him here. She had not expected him to follow her, which was not the same thing as being surprised that he had. Robert had always been persistent, in the gentle, unhurrying way of a man who believed that patience and affection were, eventually, sufficient. He was waiting in the inn's small sitting room, standing by the fireplace, turning his hat in his hands with the air of a man who had rehearsed something, and was now deciding whether to say it. He was handsome in an uncomplicated way, fair-haired, open-faced, with the kind of steady warmth that Ilara had always found easy to be near, even when she was not entirely sure what she felt about it. When she came in he smiled, and it was a good smile, the kind without agenda. "Ilara," he said. "Robert," she said, "what are you doing in Ashworth Cross?" "I heard from Finch," he said. "Not the details, I know better than to ask Finch for details, just that you were here and that it was significant, whatever it is you've been waiting to do." He paused. "I wanted to be nearby, in case." "In case of what?" He looked at her steadily. "In case you needed someone on your side who wasn't being paid for it." Ilara looked at him for a long moment. Robert Cavendish had known her for 6 years. He had known about the wooden box for 4 of them, not the contents, but the existence of it, the weight it carried. He had never pushed. He had never pressed. He had simply, over the course of those 6 years, made it consistently and undemandingly clear that he thought she was worth knowing, in the particular way of a man who has decided something and sees no reason to be dramatic about it. 2 months ago, before she had come to Ashworth Cross, he had said, quietly, without theater, that whenever she was ready to think about the future, he would like very much to be part of the conversation. She had not answered him then. She had not answered him now. But she sat down across from him by the fire, and she told him about the meeting, not all of it, but enough about the solicitors and the deed, and the afternoon at Whitmore Park. And he listened with the complete attention he always gave her, and did not ask about things she hadn't mentioned, and she was grateful for it. She was also sitting there in the firelight with Robert's quiet steadiness filling the room, acutely and inconveniently aware that she was thinking about someone else entirely. She did not examine that thought closely. Not yet. What she did not know, could not have known, was that across the village, in the study at Whitmore Park, Edmund Ashford was sitting at his father's desk in the dark, having forgotten to ring for the lamps, turning a very small and specific problem over in his mind. He had made a practical proposal. It had been refused. This was, he told himself, entirely understandable. It had not been a particularly graceful proposal, and he was self-aware enough to acknowledge that. And it changed nothing about the legal situation, which would proceed as legal situations did, and would resolve itself eventually in some negotiated form that Pemberton and Finch would spend several months arriving at. That was fine, that was manageable. What was not manageable, what he could not quite account for, sitting in the dark with the ledgers closed in front of him, was the answer to a question he had not actually asked. He had asked her what direction she was interested in. She had not answered. He found, to his considerable irritation, that he could not stop thinking about what the answer might have been. He rang for the lamps. He opened the ledgers. He stared at the numbers for 40 minutes without reading them. Then he did something he had not done in a very long time. He took out a fresh piece of paper, and he wrote not to Pemberton, not to his mother, not to anyone with a claim on his attention or a stake in his decisions. He wrote without purpose, without audience. The way he had sometimes done as a young man before life had become a series of things that needed managing. He wrote about the library and the window and the flat gray afternoon light. He wrote about a woman who had waited 9 years and arrived in the rain and said no to him with perfect composure, and then asked him nothing at all in return. He wrote 2 pages. Then he folded them, put them in the inside pocket of his coat, and did not look at them again. But he did not throw them away either. The letter from his mother arrived on Wednesday. Edmund knew, before he opened it, roughly what it would contain. His mother wrote with the regularity and precision of someone who had decided that correspondence was a form of management, and her letters followed a predictable architecture. Family news first, then social observations, then, always, inevitably, the matter of Miss Hartwell. He poured himself coffee and opened it. He was right about the architecture. The family news was brief. The social observations were pointed. And then, in the 3rd paragraph, his mother arrived at her subject with the directness of a woman who had been circling it long enough to feel entitled to land. The Hartwell dinner is confirmed for the 14th. Sir Reginald has been most accommodating, and Georgiana is a perfectly sensible girl who will, I am certain, make no unreasonable demands on your patience or your time. I trust you will make the journey to Bath without delay. Edmund, I say this as plainly as I know how. The situation at Whitmore Park requires a solution, and it requires one soon. A suitable marriage is that solution. I hope you will not allow sentiment or stubbornness to complicate what is, at its foundation, a straightforward matter. Edmund set the letter down. Sentiment his mother had written, or stubbornness, as though those were the only 2 obstacles between him and the sensible management of his own life. He thought about the word sentiment for a moment, turning it over the way he might turn over a stone to see what was underneath it. He was not, he told himself, a sentimental man. He never had been. Sentiment was what other people had, people who made decisions based on feeling rather than reason, who confused what they wanted with what made sense, who built their lives on foundations that looked appealing but didn't hold. He was not that kind of man. He picked the letter back up and read the 3rd paragraph again. Then he folded it, set it aside, and rang for Gaines. "Tell me about the Voss family," he said when Gaines appeared. Gaines settled into the careful neutrality that Edmund had come to recognize as his response to questions he found interesting. "In what sense, Your Grace?" "In the sense that I know very little about them beyond what Pemberton has put in front of me, and I would like to know more." He paused. "Not legally, generally." Gaines considered this. "I can tell you what the village knows, Your Grace, which is somewhat." "That will do." Gaines told him. The Voss family had been known in the northern counties for 3 generations, not titled, not aristocratic, but the kind of quietly substantial family that everyone in a certain radius was aware of, in the way one is aware of a large tree that has been in the same spot for a very long time. Arthur Voss, the great-grandfather, had built the family's fortune through wool and land, and the kind of careful, unhurried accumulation that didn't make for good stories, but made for very solid foundations. He had been known, Gaines said, as a fair man, not warm particularly, but fair. His daughter, Helena, Ilara's grandmother, had inherited both the fortune and the disposition. She had married a man named Voss by coincidence of surname as well as choice, a schoolteacher from Yorkshire who had died young, and she had raised her son alone, and then her granddaughter alone after him, in a house that was smaller than it had once been because various male Voss relatives had done with portions of the fortune what male Voss relatives apparently tended to do. The father, Gaines said, with the careful neutrality fully deployed, was not careful, with money or otherwise. What happened to him? He died when Miss Voss was 14. There were debts. The house in Yorkshire was sold. Helena Voss, the grandmother, stepped in and managed what remained. Gaines paused. By all accounts, Miss Voss was her grandmother's primary occupation from that point forward, her education, her prospects. Helena Voss was quite determined about it. Edmund was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. 14. Her father dead at 14, the house sold, whatever stability she had built her childhood on gone in the particular abrupt way that financial ruin went, not gradually, but all at once, a door closing on a version of life that would not reopen. He knew something about that, actually. Not the same, his version had come later and with considerably more cushioning, but the specific quality of looking at something you had assumed was permanent and understanding suddenly that it wasn't. He knew that feeling. The grandmother, he said, Helena Voss, what was she like? Gaines considered. I never met her, Your Grace. She did not travel much in her later years, but those who knew her described her as formidable in the quietest possible way. Edmund thought about Ilara at the window of the library, with the flat afternoon light on her face, saying asterisk no asterisk with perfect composure. Yes, he said, I imagine they did. After Gaines left, he sat for a long time without doing anything in particular. The ledgers were on the desk in front of him. He did not open them. He looked at the portrait above the fireplace instead. His grandfather, the second Duke, painted at perhaps 30 years old, confident and prosperous looking, with no visible indication that he was a man who had signed away his family's estate to pay his debts, and then apparently neglected to mention it to anyone. Edmund looked at him for a considerable time. You might have said something, he told the portrait. The portrait said nothing, as portraits generally didn't. He wrote out that afternoon, which he did when he needed to think, a habit from boyhood that he had never entirely shed, the particular usefulness of motion for problems that resisted stillness. He took the east path, which ran along the edge of the estate through the old woodland, where the trees were large enough to have been there in his grandfather's time, in Arthur Voss's time, before any of this had happened. He thought about the deed. He thought about 1809 and the second Duke's desperation and Arthur Voss's careful documentation of a transaction that had then sat in a box for 60 years, waiting. He thought about Ilara. He thought specifically, uncomfortably, about the morning she had arrived in the rain and been turned away from a gate that was, by any legal reckoning, as much hers as his. He thought about what that had been like, for a woman who had spent 9 years preparing for this, who had traveled 4 hours and arrived with legitimate purpose and been dismissed in 60 seconds by men who had been following his orders. He thought about her face in the carriage window as it pulled away, which he had not seen, but could, somehow, imagine with a precision that bothered him. He thought about her father's debts and the house sold when she was 14, and Helena Voss raising a granddaughter with the deliberate, patient intention of giving her something no one could take away. A piece of paper that said, "This is yours." He thought about the proposal he had made in the library, and the particular efficiency with which she had refused it, and the question he had asked afterward that she hadn't answered. What direction are you interested in? He had meant it practically, in the moment, another approach to a solution, another angle on a negotiation. He was almost certain he had meant it practically. He was considerably less certain by the time he reached the far edge of the woodland and stopped his horse at the fence line, looking out over the fields beyond. The thing about Alara Voss, he was beginning to understand, was that she had come here with a plan, a careful, documented, thoroughly prepared plan that she had been building for 9 years, and she was executing it with a precision and composure that he genuinely, inconveniently admired. She was not angry. She was not vindictive. She was not performing righteousness or nursing grievance into drama. She was simply right. Quietly, thoroughly, legally right, in a way that made all of his own certainties feel considerably less certain. He had spent his entire adult life being the person in the room who held the most cards. He had not, until this week, understood quite how much he had relied on that. He turned the horse and rode back toward the house, faster than he had come. By the time he reached the stables, he had made a decision. He was not entirely sure it was a wise one. He was not, in fact, sure at all, which was itself unusual enough to be notable. But he had made it, and he was not in the habit of remaking decisions once made, so he dismounted, handed the reins to the groom, and walked directly to his study. He did not open the ledgers. He did not write to Pemberton. He did not, God help him, write to his mother. He took out a fresh piece of paper and wrote a note to Alara Voss. It was short. He was aware, writing it, of the risk, aware that it stepped outside the careful professional boundaries of their current situation, aware that it might be received badly, aware that there were several good reasons not to send it. He sent it anyway. Alara received the note at 6:30, while she was sitting across from Robert Cavendish in the inn's small dining room, making her way through a meal that was better than she had expected, and a conversation that was comfortable in the uncomplicated way that conversations with Robert always were. She read it twice under the table, without changing her expression. Miss Voss, I find that I have something I would like to say that is not suitable for a room full of solicitors. Would you walk with me tomorrow morning if the weather permits? The grounds are better seen in daylight. Ashford. Robert, across the table, was telling her something about his sister's recent visit to Edinburgh. He was a good storyteller, warm and self-deprecating, with a natural feel for which details mattered. She had always appreciated that about him. She folded the note and put it in her pocket. "Are you all right?" Robert asked, interrupting himself mid-sentence with the attentiveness he had always had for her. "Perfectly," she said. "I'm sorry your sister. She went to Edinburgh in September." He looked at her for a moment in the way he sometimes did, not pressing, but present, fully aware that she had been somewhere else for a few seconds, and willing to simply wait until she came back. "October," he said, "and she hated the weather but loved everything else." "That sounds like Charlotte," Alara said and smiled, and returned her attention to the table. But her hand in her lap rested against the pocket where the note was folded, and she was aware of it for the rest of the evening. Its small weight, its half-dozen lines, the signature that said simply Ashford without the formal prefix, as though he had started to write something else and then thought better of it. She did not take it out again. She did not need to. She had already memorized it. She did not sleep well that night. This was unusual for her. She had always been a good sleeper, her grandmother's training extending even to rest, the ability to set a problem down at the end of a day and return to it in the morning. But she lay awake in the small room at the inn while the village settled into silence around her, and she thought about two men who were, in their entirely different ways, waiting for something from her. Robert, who had known her for 6 years, and asked for nothing she wasn't ready to give and offered everything she might reasonably want from a life built on solid, unambiguous ground. And Edmund Ashford, who had known her for 2 weeks, who had ordered her turned away from her own gate and then apologized for it, who had proposed to her with the romantic flair of a lease negotiation, and then sat in the dark writing things he had not shown anyone. She did not know about the pages in his coat pocket, could not have known, but she had felt something in that library, in that question he had asked, that she could not entirely dismiss. She was not naive. She knew what it meant to be a woman of property in her position, and she knew what it meant to catch the attention of a man in his. She had been alert from the beginning to the possibility that what she was feeling was simply the particular susceptibility of a situation that was dramatic by nature, that she was reading intention into behavior that was strategic, warmth into what was merely manner. She was alert to all of that. She was also, by 2 o'clock in the morning, honest enough with herself to acknowledge that being alert to a possibility was not the same as being certain it was true. She thought about his face when she had said no. She thought about the question afterward. She thought about what Gaines had almost certainly told him, about her father, the debts, the house sold at 14, and the particular vulnerability of being known, of having your history in someone else's hands. She turned onto her side and looked at the dark window. Tomorrow he wanted to walk with her. He had something to say that wasn't suitable for a room full of solicitors. She thought about Robert downstairs, sleeping soundly in the way of a man with a clear conscience and uncomplicated intentions. She thought about what her grandmother would have said. "Don't move before the moment is right," Helena had written. "Patience is not weakness." But Helena had also said something else, something she had said only once at the very end, when she was already very ill and the wooden box was already in Ilara's hands. "The document will give you what is yours by right asterisk," she had said. "But rights are not a life, Ilara. Don't mistake the one for the other." Ilara closed her eyes. In the morning, she decided, she would walk with him. She would listen to whatever he had to say that wasn't suitable for solicitors. And then she would make up her own mind, in her own time, on her own terms. As she always had. As she always would. What she did not know, lying there in the dark with her grandmother's words settling around her like something solid, was that across the village, Edmund Ashford had also not slept. He had sat at his desk until past midnight, and then he had done something he had not done in this house since his father died. He had gone into the old drawing room, the formal one, closed since the autumn, smelling of dust and disuse, and he had opened the cabinet where his father had kept the family papers. Not the legal ones, not the ledgers. The others. The letters and the records and the things that accumulated in a house over 150 years of people living and dying in it. He had been looking for something specific. He found it after an hour, a folder at the very back of the lowest drawer, tied with a ribbon that had once been green and was now something closer to gray. Inside were 2 documents. One was a copy of the 1809 deed, his grandfather's copy, which confirmed that the original had been known about and retained rather than lost. The other was a letter, short in his grandfather's handwriting, addressed to no one. Edmund read it standing at the cabinet, by candlelight, in the cold and dusty drawing room. "I have done what was necessary," his grandfather had written. "Voss was fair, and I was not in a position to refuse. The terms are as stated. I can only hope that whoever comes after me will have the wisdom to honor them properly, or the good fortune never to need to." Edmund stood with the letter in his hand for a long time. Then he put it carefully back in the folder, returned it to the cabinet, and went to bed. He lay in the dark and thought about good fortune and wisdom and the difference between the two, and about a woman who had waited 9 years and come back in the rain, and about a gate made of iron with a falcon at the center that had been commissioned. It turned out, by someone who had known it might one day need to be opened by the right person. He thought about what he wanted to say tomorrow, on the walk, in the cold morning air with no solicitors present. He had been rehearsing it, imperfectly, for the better part of 4 days. He still wasn't sure he would say it right. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, since before his father died, since before Europe, since before all of it, Edmund Ashford fell asleep thinking about something other than the numbers in the ledgers. The morning was cold and perfectly still, the kind that felt held, as though the world was waiting for something to happen before it committed to the day. Alara arrived at Whitmore Park at 9 o'clock. She had walked from the inn, which was perhaps 20 minutes on the village road, and the walk had done what she had hoped it would, cleared her head, settled her breathing, given her the particular composure that came from motion and cold air, and the simple fact of putting one foot in front of the other. She had not told Robert where she was going. This was not deception, she told herself. He had not asked, and what she was going to was not something she could have explained to him without saying things she was not yet ready to say about what she felt, or what she was uncertain about, which was in some ways worse than feeling nothing at all. Edmund was waiting at the front door. Not inside, outside on the top step in his coat, as though he had been there for some time. He looked, she thought, slightly less composed than usual, not dramatically so, not in a way that anyone who didn't know how to read stillness would have noticed, but she had been reading stillness for 9 years and she noticed. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Grace," she said. They looked at each other for a moment in the cold morning air. Then he came down the steps and fell into step beside her, without ceremony, and they walked. He did not speak immediately, which she had not expected. She had expected him to begin at once, to have his thing ready, his not suitable for solicitors thing, prepared and organized in the efficient way he organized everything. Instead, he walked beside her in silence for a full minute, through the formal garden at the side of the house, bare now in November, the hedges clipped and the beds empty, their feet on the gravel. She did not fill the silence. She was good at silence. "I've been thinking," he said finally, "about something you said in the library." "I said a number of things in the library." "You said you were not interested in practical, in that particular direction." He paused. "I've been trying to understand what you meant, and I think what you were telling me was that what I offered was not actually a resolution. It was another transaction, a different shape of the same problem." Alara considered this. "Yes," she said, "that's what I meant." "I wanted to tell you," he said, "that you were right." She glanced at him. He was looking ahead at the path, with the expression of a man saying something he had decided to say, and was going to say completely regardless of how it landed. "The proposal was not well considered," he said. "That is a significant understatement. It was the kind of proposal a man makes when he is treating a person as a variable in an equation, and you are not a variable in an equation, and I knew that when I said it, which makes it worse rather than better." She said nothing. She wanted to hear the rest of it. "I've spent the last week," Edmund continued, "learning things I should have understood considerably earlier, about your family, about what this," he gestured, a small contained movement that somehow encompassed the whole of it, the estate, the deed, the 9 years actually cost. Not in legal terms, in other terms. "Mr. Gaines told you," she said. "Some of it, the rest he stopped walking. She stopped too because it seemed the thing to do. They were at the edge of the formal garden now, where the path opened onto the wider parkland, the lawn stretching away to the far tree line. "I found a letter," he said. "My grandfather's. He knew about the deed. He kept a copy. He wrote that he hoped whoever came after him would have the wisdom to honor it properly." Alara was very still. "He didn't," Edmund said. "My father didn't. And I very nearly didn't either, except that you didn't give me the option of being entirely oblivious, which I suspect was not accidental." "It was not," she agreed. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile. "No, I didn't think so." He turned to look at her directly, in the full morning light, and she let him, because there was nothing in his expression now that she needed to guard against. It was not the assessment of the library, not the recalibration of a man adjusting his strategy. It was something simpler and considerably more dangerous. "I owe you more than an apology for the gate," he said. "I owe you an apology for the entirety of the position your family was put in, which I cannot make on behalf of my grandfather and my father because they are not here, but I can make it on behalf of this house and this name and everything attached to them. I am sorry, not strategically, not as an opening to a negotiation, simply sorry." Ilara looked at him for a long moment. She had prepared, 9 years ago and in all the years since, for many versions of this. She had prepared for legal resistance and social condescension, and every variety of dismissal that a man in his position could deploy against a woman in hers. She had prepared, thoroughly and without sentiment, for the worst of what people were capable of when their security was threatened. She had not, she realized, prepared for this. For a man standing in the cold morning air on the edge of his ancestors' parkland, saying simply sorry with his whole face open and nothing held back. She discovered, to her considerable inconvenience, that her eyes were warm. She did not let anything fall. She was her grandmother's granddaughter. But she said quietly, "Thank you," and meant it in a way she had not meant anything in a very long time. They walked for another hour. Not about the deed, not about solicitors or deeds or the 1809 agreement or what a resolution might look like. They talked about other things, which was itself a kind of revolution. He asked about her grandmother, and she told him about the wooden box, and the patience, and the 3 things Helena had taught her above all others. He listened in the complete way she had noticed in the library, the way that meant he was actually thinking about what she said and not simply waiting for his turn. She asked about Europe, not the finances, not the strategic reasons for his absence, but what it had been like. He told her about Florence, about a particular morning in a particular square when the light had been something he had no adequate language for, and about Vienna in winter, and about the specific loneliness of being somewhere beautiful with no one to say look at that too. She understood that feeling. She did not say so, but something in her face must have said it anyway because he looked at her with recognition, the specific look of a person who has said a true thing and found it received. They were on the far side of the parkland by then, the house small in the distance behind them and ahead of them. She saw it before she understood where they had walked to, the iron gate. Not the main gate on the road, a smaller one at the edge of the grounds where the park met the woodland path. Old iron with no crest, no falcon, just the plain practical gate of a working estate, hinged into stone pillars that she recognized from her grandmother's papers as the original pillars, the ones described in the letter. She stopped. Edmund stopped beside her. "I didn't plan this," he said. "The path just," he looked at the gate, then at her. "Is this?" "My grandmother described these pillars," Ilara said. Her voice was even. "In a letter, she watched them being set." Edmund said nothing. He looked at the pillars, old stone dark with weather and moss, and then at the gate between them and then at her. "Ilara," he said. It was the first time he had used her name, not Miss Voss, not a formal address. Just her name in the cold morning air, quietly, the way you said someone's name when you meant something by it. She looked at him. "I would like to begin again," he said. "Not the legal situation that will resolve itself. Finch and Pemberton will manage it. That is what they are for. I mean this." He indicated the space between them with the same small contained gesture he had used before. "Whatever this is, I would like to start from the beginning of it properly, without transactions or strategy or proposals that are not proposals." She held his gaze. "And what would the beginning look like?" "I think," he said, "it would look like asking whether you would consent to my company, not for legal purposes, not for negotiations, simply my company, on occasion." The gate was beside them. The stone pillars her great-grandmother had commissioned and watched set into the ground on a cold October morning in 1809, 200 years of weather and history in the moss on the stone, and the iron between them plain and old and solid. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. "There is something I should tell you," she said. His expression did not change, but she felt him still, the particular stillness of a man bracing himself. "There is someone else," she said, "a man who has known me for 6 years and has been patient and kind, and who came here because he wanted to be nearby in case I needed someone on my side." She paused. "He is a good man." Edmund said nothing with great care. "I have not made him any promises," she said, "but I want you to understand the entirety of the situation, because I find that I cannot do business with you of any kind without telling you the truth." A long silence. The wind moved through the woodland beyond the gate. Somewhere above them, a bird called once and then was quiet. "What will you do?" Edmund said. His voice was even. She could hear what it cost him. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I need time." He nodded once. "Then you shall have it." She looked at him, at his face in the cold light, open in the way it had not been in the library, in the way she suspected it was not often open for anyone. "The gate," she said. "You said you wanted to begin again, properly." "Yes." "Then open it," she said. "Not because I own it, not because of 1809 or the deed or any of that. Open it because you choose to." He looked at the gate, at the old iron and the stone pillars, and everything they contained, history and wrong, and the long patient wait of her family's waiting. Then he reached out, and he put his hand on the latch, and he opened the gate. He stepped back. She walked through. On the other side she turned and looked at him, still standing in the parkland, the open gate between them. "I'll give you my answer," she said, "when I have one, not before." "I know," he said. She looked at him for one more moment, this man who had ordered her turned away in the rain and then stood in the cold to apologize for it, who had found his grandfather's letter and understood what it meant, who had opened a gate not because he had to, but because she had asked him to. Then she turned and walked into the woodland, along the path, away from Whitmore Park. She did not look back. But she heard behind her very quietly the sound of him not walking away, just standing there, at the gate. Waiting. Robert was in the inn's small sitting room when she returned, with a book open on his lap and tea going cold on the table beside him. He looked up when she came in, and his face did what it always did when he saw her, opened, simply, with no performance in it. She sat down across from him. She looked at him, at his familiar, uncomplicated face, at the steadiness in him that she had relied on for 6 years, at the good man he genuinely and thoroughly was. "Robert," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not hurt, not yet. Just the careful attention of a man who had always been very good at hearing what she was not quite saying. "Tell me," he said quietly. So she did. Not everything, but enough. She told him about the library and the question she hadn't answered, and the walk this morning, and the gate. She told him with the precision and honesty that her grandmother had taught her, because Robert deserved nothing less, because he was good, and she respected him completely and cared for him genuinely, and because caring for someone genuinely meant not allowing them to wait for something that wasn't coming. He listened to all of it. When she was done, the room was quiet. The fire crackled. Outside, the village went about its ordinary morning. "You're certain," he said, not wounded, not accusing, just asking. "No," she said honestly. "Not yet. I'm not certain of anything. But I know I'm not. I know what I feel when I think about him, and I know what I feel when I think about you, and they are not the same thing, and you deserve someone who—" "Elara," he stopped her gently with the ease of long familiarity. "I know." She looked at him. "I've known," he said, "for rather longer than you have, I think." She felt the warmth in her eyes again, This time one thing fell, and she did not stop it. He leaned forward and put his hand over hers, briefly, the way you touched something you were letting go of. Be certain before you decide, he said. About him. Don't let the drama of a situation make you think something is more than it is. I know, she said. But if it is what it seems, he stopped. You deserve someone who looks at you the way you've apparently been looked at this morning. And he sat back. I deserve someone who looks at me that way. She nodded. She could not speak for a moment. We are going to be perfectly fine, Robert said, in the tone of a man deciding something rather than describing it. Both of us. She believed him. She believed him completely. He left Ashworth Cross the following morning. She stood at the door of the inn and watched his carriage until it turned the corner and disappeared, and she stood there a moment longer after it had gone. Then she went inside, went upstairs, and sat at the small writing desk with the wooden box open in front of her and her grandmother's letter in her hands. She read it this time, all of it from the beginning. And when she reached the last lines, the ones she had read 100 times, the ones she knew before her eyes reached them, she sat with them for a long while in the quiet room. The document will give you what is yours by right, but rights are not a life, Ilara. Don't mistake the one for the other. Wait for the right moment. Not to act, you will know when to act. Wait for the right man. You will know him because he will not ask you to be less than you are. He will open doors, not close them. She folded the letter. She put it back in the box. She sat for a long time in the afternoon quiet, thinking about a gate and a man standing on the other side of it, waiting, and the sound of a latch lifted by a hand that chose to lift it. Then she took out a fresh piece of paper, and she wrote. Not to Edmund, not yet. She wrote to Mr. Finch. Please arrange a meeting for next week. All parties. I believe we are ready to discuss terms. She sealed it, set it aside, and then, after a moment's consideration, took out another piece of paper. This one she addressed to Whitmore Park. She wrote 4 sentences. I have given you my honest assessment of the situation, as I said I would. I have also given it to myself. I find that my answer in both cases is the same. If you would like to walk again on Thursday, I am available. She did not sign it Miss Voss *. She signed it Ilara. He received it at 6 o'clock. He read it in the study, standing, still in his coat from an afternoon ride. He read it 3 times, not because it was ambiguous. It was not. But because he wanted to be certain he was reading what was actually there, and not what he hoped was there. It was there. He sat down slowly in his father's chair. He looked at the portrait above the fireplace. His grandfather, the second Duke, young and unaware of all the things that letter in the drawing-room cabinet would eventually set in motion. The wisdom to honor it properly the old man had written, or the good fortune never to need to. Edmund looked at him for a long time. Neither in the end, he said quietly. It was something else entirely. He reached for a piece of paper. He wrote back in 2 lines. Thursday morning, I will be at the gate. Edmund. 1 year later, the gate had a new sign. Not a large one, nothing ostentatious, nothing that announced itself from a distance. Just a small iron plate bolted to the right pillar, engraved in clean letters, Voss Ashford Whitmore Park, Est 1809. Ilara had suggested 1809. Edmund had agreed without hesitation. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, the anniversary of nothing in particular, and she was walking the woodland path alone in the early light the way she sometimes did before the house woke up, before Mrs. Gaines arrived with the morning correspondence, and before Edmund came downstairs with the expression he wore when he had been thinking about the East Tennant Farms again. She liked the hour before all of that. She liked the particular quality of a house that was hers in every sense, legal, lived in, loved, before the day made its claims on it. The legal settlement had taken 4 months. Finch and Pemberton had, in the end, arrived at something that satisfied the document and the present circumstances simultaneously. A formal acknowledgement of the Voss claim, a restructuring of the estate's financial obligations, and a deed of joint ownership that made what was already true on paper also true in every practical sense. It was, Pemberton had said, with the satisfaction of a man who had spent a career on less interesting work, quite without precedent. Alara had signed it on a Wednesday afternoon in February, in this very library, with Edmund across the table and both solicitors present. And when it was done, Edmund had looked at her across the stack of documents and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying, and she had understood that completely. They had married in April, quietly in the village church, with no London guests and no fanfare, and exactly the ceremony they had both, independently, wanted, which was to say a short one, followed by a long lunch, followed by a walk in the parkland in the late afternoon light. Robert Cavendish had sent a generous gift, and a note in his clear handwriting that said simply, "I told you we would both be perfectly fine." He was, she had heard, recently engaged to a woman in York who looked at him, by all accounts, exactly the way he deserved to be looked at. She was glad. The house was different now in the ways that mattered. Not transformed, she had not wanted transformation, had not arrived here to remake everything in her own image, but attended to. The east wing's roof, which had been quietly failing for 3 winters, was repaired. The tenant farms had been visited properly for the first time in a decade. The flower beds along the front were replanted, not extravagantly but carefully, the way her grandmother would have done it, with the intention that they would be better in 3 years than they were today, and better still in 10. Small things, the right things. She reached the gate and stopped. She put her hand on the iron, cold in the morning air, and stood for a moment in the quiet. The woodland beyond was bare now, the trees stripped down to their essential shapes, beautiful in the particular way of things that had nothing left to hide. She heard footsteps on the gravel behind her. She did not turn immediately. She knew the sound of him by now, the particular rhythm of his walk, unhurried but deliberate, the sound of a man who had somewhere to be and was not anxious about reaching it. He came to stand beside her, close enough that their arms touched. He looked at the gate, at the sign on the pillar, at the woodland beyond. "You're up early," he said. "I always am." "I know." A pause. "Gaines found something in the cabinet in the drawing room. He thought you should see it." She turned to look at him. He was holding a letter, old paper, folded, the handwriting on the outside faded to near illegibility. Not his grandfather's hand, older than that. She took it carefully, opened it. The ink was brown with age, and the script was the formal, careful hand of someone writing in the early years of the century, before shortcuts had become acceptable. She read it slowly, in the morning light. It was from Arthur Voss, her great-grandfather, written, by the date in the corner, in November of 1809, 1 month after the deed was signed. Addressed, as far as she could tell, to no one, or perhaps to everyone. The kind of letter a man wrote for the record, for the future, for whoever might eventually need to read it. It was short. "I have done what seemed right, not without difficulty, and not without awareness that I may never see the outcome of it. That is the nature of these things. We plant what we plant and we trust the ground. I have one hope only, that whoever stands at the end of this, whatever form the end takes, will find it was worth the waiting. I believe it will be. I have always believed that things come right in time for people who do not abandon the right thing simply because the right time has not yet arrived. The gates are fine, finer than I imagined. I hope they last." Alara read it twice. Then she stood for a long moment with the letter in her hands and the cold morning air around her and the gate beside her, and she let herself feel the full weight of it. The 117 years between that letter and this morning, the wooden box and the patient women who had carried it forward, the rain and the gate and everything that had happened since. Edmund said nothing. He was watching her with the complete attention she had come to rely on, the kind that asked nothing and offered everything. She folded the letter carefully. She held it for a moment. Then she looked at the gate, at the iron and the stone, and the small engraved sign that said *1809. And she thought about her great-grandfather watching it being set into the ground on a cold October morning, and about Helena writing, "They are finer than I imagined *," and about a woman in the rain who had turned away without a word and written 4 sentences to a solicitor and waited. They lasted *, she thought. She tucked the letter into her coat pocket, next to her heart, where she intended to keep it. Then she reached out and took Edmund's hand, and he closed his fingers around hers, and they stood together at the gate in the quiet morning while the light came up slowly over Whitmore Park, and the day began. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.